Right, good morning, everyone. I want to thank my fellow presenters here who will be following me. Again, my name is Ryan Thatcher. I'm with Rincon Consultants, and we can dive right in here. So the purpose of this talk today, the point of this presentation is really to start a conversation. And this is a conversation that has been had in the past. We live in a very incredible state. I absolutely love California. But we also live in a state that is sort of in constant conflict with itself. For example, on one hand, we have some of the most pressing housing, water utility, green energy needs. But on the flip side, we struggle to often meet these needs because we also are home to some of the most restrictive environmental regulations, for better and for worse. And so I want to zoom in this conversation onto another sort of balancing act between those typical remediation practices we employ at brownfield redevelopment sites and climate, and the risk balance between the two there. The whole intention here is maybe it's going to start making more sense to meet some of these needs we have with regards to housing and climate, to leave more contamination in the ground under controlled circumstances, of course. So I'm going to dive into that in a little bit more detail here. I'd like to acknowledge a couple team members here, my colleague Torrin, who's in the crowd, and my colleague Lily, who've been great brainstorming buddies on this kind of fun and interesting topic. So a little bit about Rincon, which ties into the presentation here. We've been around for 30 years, and we are a very California-centric firm. We're focused on all things environmental throughout the state, and we rarely step over state borders. We have actually closer to 500 professional staff now who are spread across many different technical service areas, providing a lot of support to all sorts of development throughout the state. I want to zoom in here on our sustainability services for a moment, where we've been doing greenhouse gas verification to support California's cap-and-trade program for a very long time, one of the largest in the state that do that. We're also on the leading edge of climate adaptation and action plans, vulnerability assessments, and the like. And so I've been fortunate to be able to work alongside professionals working in this space. And it's planted the seeds of, what is our responsibility in the work that we do with land recycling, with remediation, with redevelopment and brownfields. What is our responsibility to consider the impacts to climate that our work has? So this brings me to the topic today of using an evaluation of impacts to climate and society as a cleanup planning tool. So when we're talking about impacts to climate, we're thinking immediately greenhouse gas emissions, right? Carbon emissions. The concept of sustainable remediation practices is nothing new. There's been great talks at conferences such as this for years and years on innovative technologies to break down, remediate, address contaminants. Yet we don't see application of these technologies at a lot of our typical metropolitan-based brownfield sites, and there's a reason for that. We're often working against tight timelines, tight budgets, and I can say that my role as a consultant on these types of projects is often to find the path of least resistance to getting a project shovel-ready. On the society front, in discussing impacts to society, and environmental justice here, which Ingrid will be speaking to later, we can think about this through two different lenses. One, impacts associated with brownfield sites as they lie within existing communities, right? These are blights to the community. There could be threats of contaminant release or ongoing release. These could also be sites that just elicit bad behavior within our communities. So there's those risks inherent to having these within our communities as they lie. On the flip side, there are also risks associated with the work that we do to remediate and clean up and redevelop these sites. These are risks associated with dust, traffic, air quality, etc., as well as carbon emissions associated with this kind of conventional, I'll say, dig and haul approach we use on so many of these brownfield sites to get them to shovel ready as quickly as possible. So when we look to this diagram here of cleanup planning, when we're often evaluating what's the best pathway to get a site from point A to point B, get it shovel ready, we're looking at effectiveness, we're looking at feasibility and cost, and we're looking at implementability. What we're not talking about is climate. We're not talking about the communities that these projects are being implemented in. So what I'm proposing here is giving climate and society a seat at the table, a more prominent consideration as we go through evaluating cleanup alternatives at these sites. So a little bit more on the drivers behind this, climate legislation being a significant one. We've got nearly 2 decades of climate legislation in California. Most of you are probably familiar with SB 100, where we're striving for carbon neutrality and 100% clean energy by 2045, right around the corner. And working for this organization, as I mentioned, I interact with our climate sustainability professionals regularly. And I see the impacts that this legislation is having on our cities, our agencies, our private and public entities out there. People are redefining, rethinking the way they do business, the way they operate, at great expense and investment to try to meet the requirements that are coming out of this legislation. And so again, it drives me to this question is, what is our responsibility, those in this room, geologists, engineers, those who plan, those who implement, and looking to our oversight agencies, those who approve our cleanup plans, what is our responsibility to consider climate in this equation? Are we exempt from this because the work we do inherently, cleans up contaminants, or do we need to think about this more critically? So on to another driver here. Let's go back to housing. We just heard a great opening presentation on housing disparity, housing needs. This graph here, or this diagram, I should say, on the right shows a shortfall of low-income housing units across the state. We see the nice dark green one there on the bottom, LA County, with at least 500,000 of low-income housing units needed to meet existing demand. Across the state, we're talking millions, several million housing units needed. So we could expect to see a continued explosion of housing development across the state to meet these needs. Tens, hundreds of thousands of housing projects over time. And a lot of these will be prioritized on brownfield sites. As Greg will speak to here in a little bit, brownfield sites are encouraged for housing redevelopment. They're actually climate friendly at the end of the day. They're transit-oriented, centrally located. There are inherent benefits. But these sites also often come with impacts to soil vapor that need to be managed before we can rebuild. And so as we start thinking about just the sheer volume of building on brownfield sites, do our conventional practices that we employ to get these projects to a finish line to start construction as quickly as possible, does it make sense to keep doing what we're doing, our dig and haul approaches with using heavy diesel equipment to manage these risks as easily as possible? Or is it time to rethink how we approach these sites for a cumulative climate benefit? Let's also think about PFAS. There'll be some great discussions on this today at this conference. This is not a state issue, this is not a nationwide issue, this is a global issue, right? The information presented on this graph, these are data from EPA that have been plotted up. These are not all release sites shown on the map, but these are locations where industry has established itself, industries that often use PFAS-containing compounds. So EPA's identified more than 120,000 facilities across the US that could be PFAS release sites. And if we look at this graph on the right, here in California, we're very familiar with a lot of these top 10 industries. So how are we going to manage the PFAS issue? Are we going to be falling back on these conventional carbon-intensive remediation practices? Or are we going to start thinking a little bit more proactively about the climate risk associated with doing things the way we've always done them? So I want to bring this back to the concepts of cleanup planning. So what do we think about when we're figuring out the best way to clean up a site? Well, we're always thinking about risk, right? Human health, ecological risk. We think about the media that's impacted, the extent of those impacts, exposure scenarios. This all gets baked into our conceptual site models. The regulatory setting plays a pretty critical role here. We need to understand whether that contamination source is on-site or off-site. That might dictate the direction we go. The agencies we're working with, there's going to be a pathway we need to follow to reach ultimate compliance and get this project shovel-ready. And we have project design features that are also going to influence that pathway to compliance and feed into these cleanup alternatives. Project constraints are always a driving factor, right? We have budgets, we have schedules, we have timelines. We have funding tied to certain timelines. You know, things need to happen on a particular schedule very often. So, back to this concept of giving climate and society an equal seat at the table in this evaluation. Let's look at the emissions associated with what we're describing. Let's look at sustainability metrics. Let's do a more robust evaluation of community impact. And through this evaluation, we might see that there are other preferred alternatives to the way we manage impacts at sites. This could lead to the suggestion of leaving more contamination in the ground in a controlled, monitored, managed setting. The big but with that statement, though, is that we all know that capping in place, for example, comes with so many strings attached. While a developer might see some very short-term financial benefit for not having to go through a big dig and haul, for example, that may save on schedule and push things forward faster. On the back end, they could be stuck with monitoring and management in perpetuity. And that can be a tough sell to both the clients I work with, but also a tough sell to the communities that this work will impact. They need to understand the pros and the cons that go into this type of analysis. So to give climate and society a proper seat at the table, there also needs to be fundamental change to the regulatory frameworks that are being applied to brownfield redevelopment. The incentives simply aren't there to push for this type of solution at a lot of sites. And so that's something that we need to be working with our local oversight agencies and our government to really pursue. How can we inspire more climate-friendly approaches to clean up on these brownfield sites, again with the tight timelines, the tight schedules, to help build out the infrastructure, the housing that we need. I'm going to go through a couple quick examples here just to throw some CO2 emissions data at you, provide a little context. We have a site in Los Angeles. We estimate about 5,000 yards of soil are going to be off-hauled for disposal. 99% of this is non-hazardous waste. The site is entirely capped currently, and post-development will be entirely capped. So the dig and haul activity that will occur at this site is going to result in about 120 tons of CO2 equivalents. To give a point of reference, this is the same as about 1,100 additional personal vehicles on the road commuting in the area during that same duration of remediation, so during that month or so of dig and haul activity. We're also looking at particulate matter emissions, PM10, PM2.5, which will only be contributing to the emissions that this community is already subject to as a result of being adjacent to two major freeways. So on this project, though, the direction has always been path of least resistance. It's been encouraged by our oversight agency, our client is comfortable with it, and what I see this as is a missed opportunity. This is an opportunity where a cap in place, more climate-friendly potential alternative should at least been considered, and we can see kind of the climate implications of that decision-making. So with the scale on the right here, cleanup was prioritized over climate. Another example here is a soil vapor extraction project we have going on in Orange County. So we installed an SVE system in 2022, and in that first year, we got about 85 pounds of PCE out of the ground. However, in the second year of operation, we got 4 pounds out of the ground at the expense of about 40 tons of CO2 equivalents. 1 pound of PCE out of the ground, 10 tons of CO2 emitted to the atmosphere. So we actually brought this evaluation to the oversight agency in this case. And this, among with several other project-specific factors, are actually contributing to conversations leading towards closure. Closure, of course, with engineering controls, with monitoring in place, the land use covenant, but leaving PCE in the ground at concentrations exceeding cleanup criteria in a controlled fashion. So in this example, climate has actually helped sort of tip the scales versus cleanup in this case, as we're moving towards a potential closure. So next steps. How can we put some of these concepts into practice? Well, we can start having these discussions with our clients, with the developers. Will an evaluation of climate and society, will this fit into your project? Will this help with decision making? At the same time, as we're incorporating new sort of evaluations into these analyses that we're putting out for public digestion, we need to increase that communication with the communities that will be impacted by this decision making. And while those conversations are often facilitated by the regulatory agencies who are overseeing this work, I think about myself as a consultant. What is the information that I can provide to this oversight agency? How can I work more creatively with them so that it can better communicate the pros and the cons of decision making to the communities that we're impacting? And third here, I think we all need to continue to strive for a more streamlined closure policy if we're going to give climate and society a seat at the table. The way things are currently structured, it can be a hard sell to do anything other than our kind of conventional carbon-intensive remediation practices. Because again, so often on these brownfield redevelopment sites, it's the path of least resistance we're striving for. And so we need to bring, if we're going to bring carbon accounting and community considerations into the fold, we need to rethink the way that these closure policies are put in place and the impacts those have on decision making. But people like myself can only try to inspire conversation on these topics. At the end of the day, this does need to be driven by government, but I think we all have a role to play in maintaining this conversation and figuring out how we can work together more effectively to find solutions to our brownfield sites that are going to help be more transparent with our communities, more transparent for our developers, more climate friendly. So with that, I will wrap up. Thank you all for the time.
All right, good morning, everyone. My name is Greg Schaefer. I am DTSC's statewide brownfield coordinator, and I am also a unit chief out of our Chatsworth office here in Los Angeles County. I am going to center my talking points really around the kind of current status of DTSC's process, how climate is taken into account in a small way here at DTSC, and then, thank you. And then also to the point of this talk, potentially some other alternatives that could be taken into consideration. So first I want to start with the establishment that Ryan did start us off on, that brownfields inherently have a climate positive impact when we're talking about development. And the state of California has recognized this as early as 2004 with the passage of the California Land Reuse and Revitalization Act. We call it CLARA here. But properties that are already centrally located in urban infill environments prevent the development of greenfields or previously undisturbed land that is currently occupied by native vegetation, wildlife, and all those wonderful I think benefits that we have here. But it also reduces the need for additional natural resources to be used in terms of development of roads and utilities and connecting all of these things to the current grid essentially. They are also, again, being centrally located within an already urbanized environment. It reduces overall vehicle miles traveled, reduces traffic, and all of these carbon intensive practices of just existing in an urban environment. To some of Ryan's earlier points as well, the kind of status quo of what kind of the remedial technologies are typically relatively carbon intensive, whether they're just energy intensive or actually greenhouse gas burning on the get-go at the site. So soil vapor extraction, if you're doing any sort of groundwater treatment over the long term, as well as excavation, hauling that, all the vehicle miles traveled to haul soil off-site, all have, significant climate impacts depending on the time, distance, or amount of contaminants that you are removing from any specific site. And then to Ryan's point earlier too of, PFAS is an emerging contaminant within the of course, state, but also nationwide and globally. There may not even be enough landfill space to just remove all that PFAS contaminated soil and put it somewhere, right? So we really do need to take a hard look at the amount of soil that we are just removing as a presumptive remedy at many of our projects. I'm going to touch on this a couple more times, but all of the cleanup actions that are reviewed and approved by DTSC must also meet community acceptance. So when we're talking about alternative alternative, remedy selection or innovative technologies, DTSC is always looking for community buy-off at the same time, which could be, they could be supportive of new technologies, contaminant destruction, or they may be opposed to it, and I'll get into that a little bit more as well. Some of these, I think I've talked about some of these already, but within DTSC's process, the cleanup planning or cleanup implementation is absolutely the most carbon-intensive process within our overall purview of what DTSC does in our cleanup programs. The way that we do currently evaluate climate in a kind of an offhand way is through CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. In 2018, it was updated to require an analysis of greenhouse gas emissions whenever an agency makes one of these decisions. So DTSC does review the greenhouse gas emissions on an individual action basis for each of these decisions when we're making a cleanup, the decision to approve a cleanup plan. But there is no holistic, how many cleanup plans has DTSC approved this year? What is the overall carbon footprint of the decisions that DTSC has made on the sites that we're overseeing? Similarly, all of the work conducted nationwide is really informed by the National Contingency Plan and the 9 criteria that decisions need to be made on when we're making cleanup decisions. None of I looked through the NCP as thoroughly as I could. It's a very large document, but I could not find any mention of carbon, no mention of sustainability, no mention of greenhouse gas emissions, any of those things. I think that's an artifact of the time when it was passed. It was passed quite a long time ago at this point in the early 80s when, which really spurred a lot of the industry that we have today. But again, climate not being a consideration in that is a big role in why you're not seeing it in our regulatory decision-making either. Now, there are some potential climate offsets. As Ryan mentioned, so much of the work that we do is done through the path of least resistance, whether that path of least resistance is for time constraints, cost restraints, implementability, any number of things. Right before this talk too, Ryan was talking to me about even just the size of your site can dictate the feasibility of whether any of these remedial technologies would be a viable option if you're trying to do an on-site treatment, for example. If you're working in an urban infill environment, you may not have the luxury of a lot of space or an open air area where there aren't a lot of passersby or traffic or other considerations. But some of the potential climate offsets that we have seen at DTSC include utilization of renewable energy on site if you have some sort of energy-intensive remediation system, installation of solar panels to help offset some of those energy costs. Of course, cost being the bottom line in many of these projects led by private parties, but that same cost savings also translates to a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. On-site containment through capping in place or consolidation and capping in place, utilization of electric vehicles when traveling to and from the site, or as we start trying to meet our statewide climate goals, utilization of trucks to electric vehicles to actually haul waste off site, or a combination of remedial alternatives like Ryan also mentioned, where potentially you clean up to a higher contaminant, you leave a higher contaminant level in place in order to, again, kind of buy off on the climate impacts or potential emissions impacts instead of just trying to continually suck up very small concentrations over time of remaining volatiles or whatnot. But again, these cleanup alternatives are subject to community acceptance and technical feasibility. So I'm going to skip this slide, and I think I'm going to come back to it. The one thing I want to mention back here is kind of the question of the societal impact of these cleanup decisions as well. When DTSC has had some conversations with various community groups throughout the state, they all have their own priorities, right? No community is exactly the same in what they want. And so, but the same thing, I would say the same consistent background to all of these decision makings is that these communities have been bearing the burden of this contamination for decades, right? And they want to see different things in their communities, whether it's transformation or whether, and that also translates to these cleanup decisions, right? It's a kind of a bigger question to say, yes, of course, we can dig it all out and remove it. There's always the question of, where are you putting it? Who is on the receiving end of this contamination? But also even asking a community to say, we understand that you've been burdened by this contamination for decades, and we're going to continue to ask you to bear this burden through these controlled measures of a cap or whatnot, because a broader societal impact of climate considerations, right? It's, again, really society is relying on these overburdened communities and saying, please take another one for the team, right, by leaving this in place in your community. So I do think that's another important consideration when we are considering these, leaving contamination in place at any specific site. I did want to touch on one thing that DTSC has done recently. I think it was last year or possibly the year before. DTSC finalized its sea level rise guidance. This is, of course, a reaction to climate change, not a proactive attempt to address climate issues. But DTSC does require the sea level rise guidance to be taken into consideration when we are looking at approving a cleanup plan. Specifically, we're looking at a 3.5-foot rise in sea level by 2050 and a 6-foot rise by 2100. And so any contamination left in place within an area that is anticipated to have increased groundwater elevation, or if it's located near a coastline that is going to have that sea level rise in the subsurface as well, this needs to be taken into account. There is a handy little graphic here that is included in the guidance. I won't go through this, but it kind of walks you through when the sea level rise guidance would be applicable and when it needs to be taken into account for your decision making under DTSC's oversight. We also mentioned, it was also mentioned yesterday during the conference by Miriam Tasnif-Abbasi, our brownfield development manager, that DTSC has undertaken this treatment technology council. And it was a really strong coalition of various stakeholders that have some input in DTSC's process. It includes environmental justice advocates, financing institutions, including banks, consultants, builders, US EPA, academia, and as well as DTSC's site mitigation and restoration program, and a lot of engineering staff who help approve our remedial designs. It was really intended on how we can effectively incorporate thoughtful and robust cleanup alternatives. And I think this plays really well into this discussion that we're having on climate talk, during this climate talk about the path of least resistance, or presumptive technologies is the term that we use a lot too, where you have a specific contaminant, we have a tried and true method to get it cleaned up, but it may not be the most climate smart alternative. What DTSC is looking to do through this, as a result of this Treatment Technology Council, and I think I'm going to go back to this C3 slide, is we're looking to require more robust alternative analyses when we're doing our cleanup planning to take into account some possibly innovative solutions, and as well as actual contaminant destruction, and investigating what it would actually take to get a site cleaned up to an unrestricted standard. So many times people will default to commercial industrial standard because there's a lower cost associated with it or easier feasibility. But we really want people to actually put in the legwork, do the background review and analysis to understand what it would really take to get a site cleaned up with actual we call it contaminant destruction technology, and whether or not that would be a viable alternative. Sometimes I think the easiest case from a regulatory perspective is making the case of cost again. When you look at DTSC's requirements for financial assurance, typically DTSC is asking people to pony up essentially 30 years of cost in some sort of set aside for any long-term mitigation measures. So when you compare the cost of fronting 30 years of inspection, monitoring, maintenance, and compare that to the cost of actually removing contamination or utilizing some sort of contaminant treatment on site, the costs tend to come more within the realm of possibility. So it is something that we are pushing into, again, more robust cleanup alternatives. And this is going to be something that we roll out, I think, over the next few years. The Treatment Technology Council is really going to be used as a springboard to jump into this community-considerate cleanup approach that DTSC is taking. With that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Ingrid.
All right. My name is Ingrid Brostrom, and I'm actually wearing a couple of hats today. I am the Climate Sustainability and Jobs Program Director at the UC Merced Community and Labor Center. And I'm also a member of the Board of Environmental Safety. So this is a great panel because it kind of combines my two hats, climate on the one hand, DTSC on the other. So very happy to be here. And so before I start, I want to just talk about a little bit of the lens that I'm coming with today. And, you know, my focus in my work is really about how do we uplift community and community needs. And so I know that our last slide just kind of talked about community considerate cleanups, and that's kind of where I'm launching from, is, you know, how does climate enter into the equation when we talk about what the community wants to see in the onsite remediation where they live? And so a little bit more of a definition of what we mean when we say community considerate cleanups. This is a new term. I think DTSC is trying to come up with a new acronym. Maybe it'll be C3. DTSC loves these acronyms. But really, the idea behind this is that we're designing cleanups through the lens of the people in the area where the cleanup will both take place on the one hand, and also where the waste might end up in terms of disposal. And so really centering the communities that will be ultimately impacted by site remediation. You know, through this lens, we want to prioritize the preferences of the impacted communities. And, you know, to me, you know, before I came to UC Merced, my real background is actually as an environmental justice advocate for the last 16 years in the Central Valley. And so for me, uplifting the values of environmental justice, you know, always, you know, filter into my work and in my lens. And so really centering some of these environmental justice principles, including self-determination, you know, that residents who are impacted, they speak for themselves, and that we also want to empower people. And how do we do this through regulatory processes that haven't always followed these principles? And another thing that I think is important to point out when I'm thinking about, you know, these cleanups and how climate impacts are relevant is this idea that, you know, even if the regulatory bodies and the developers believe that, you know, that there's very little harm, communities that I've worked with, you know, they don't have a lot of trust at this point in either the regulators or the developers to take them at their word. And so, and I've worked with about a dozen or so communities, and that's also going to be out, you know, part of my lens is just what I've heard from the communities that I've worked with. And so you can have a piece of paper that says, you know, there's no route of exposure or it's below, you know, some threshold. But the people that live in that area, they are legitimately concerned and afraid of the potential for risk exposure. And that in and of itself is a harm to the local community. It's harmful because of the fear and the stress load. It's harmful because, you know, the perception that this is, you know, this is a community that has a lot of brownfields or that has leave-in-place type remedies. So I don't think saying that, you know, things are safe is enough of a standard for us when we're thinking about community considerate cleanup. So, so it's not only that we feel safe that the harm is gone, but it's really that the residents who live there feel safe. And then finally, something that's been concerning for a long time, and obviously it's in federal law, so, but in the National Contingency Plan, community acceptance is the last of the 9 factors, you know, and it's only a mitigating factor. So generally, it is not prioritized as high as cost, efficiency, some of these other things that are scaled higher. So, you know, again, the perception is the community perspective here is the least important, and that's how many communities feel when they're, you know, when they're trying to impact cleanup decisions in their communities. So I think, one of our other panelists mentioned it before, but environmental justice communities, they're incredibly variable in their interests. And so it's not like this is the community perspective. I can't offer that. But what I'm going to offer you is, in having worked with about a dozen or so different communities on site mitigation, these are some of the themes that I've heard, and I'll share those with you. But again, there could be other perspectives out there, and also even within the themes that I'm going to share, people come down on different sides of it. But in general, one of the themes that I have seen is there's a pretty big split between communities that really want to see a dig and haul. They want to see soil out, because any soil that remains has a potential risk. So they think the safest thing for their community is soil removal. So you have that perspective. You also have communities that believe very strongly against shifting burdens. And so their preference is in situ treatment or on-site destruction of contamination. And these communities tend to prioritize, not wanting to send their waste to Buttonwillow Kettleman, which receives a lot of our waste, because, the EJ community and movement try to avoid shifting harms. So you have a pretty, a split between those two perspectives. And then pretty universally, where I've seen kind of the most opposition from communities is, caps, deed restrictions, natural attenuation remedies that basically leave the waste in place and try to, put a barrier to exposure or, allow for an eventual breakdown of the contamination. So those are definitely seen as the least preferable options, and there's a lot of skepticism around any of these types of remedies. So in terms of where climate comes up in these conversations with communities, quite frankly, generally it doesn't come up as often as you might think. So truck transportation does come up. So dig and haul remedies, obviously there will be a lot of trucks involved transporting the waste through their communities, and also to Kettleman, Buttonwillow, and other disposal sites. So, kind of harm on both sides, potentially with the truck emissions. However, really when I've heard that concern, it is couched in not the climate or the GHG emissions, but really about the air quality. So that has come up quite a bit, is those transportation-related impacts, but less so kind of this concern about the GHG emissions. And I will say, in the kind of the gamut of, or hierarchy of concerns, these air quality concerns with site remediation have kind of played second fiddle to the primary concern, which is potential exposure to the site contaminant. So it is a concern, but it hasn't raised to the level of wanting to just make sure that that contamination is no longer there. And so, where I have seen climate come up a lot more is not on the site remediation impacts on climate, it's on the climate's impact to site remediation. So that has definitely been way more prevalent, and it's come up on a number of cleanups that I've been supporting. So, with the adverse and the changing weather systems, that in of itself can create more risk that, that may not be sufficiently planned for. So there's concerns about heavy rains, so bigger storms, coming onto sites that might be in the middle of a site mitigation that can either push or migrate those contaminants into groundwater if it's not sufficiently covered during site, or that they can these storms disturb active remediation sites. Wind storms kicking up and spreading contaminated soils, as well as in the Central Valley where I do most of my work, also valley fever spores also can be kicked up. Droughts, like prolonged droughts, again, very prevalent in the Central Valley. We've seen many, many years of droughts. Reducing groundwater tables so that, there's not a good way to monitor our groundwater. rendering a lot of those monitoring wells ineffective. Obviously flooding, again, we had one just into 2023, big floods in the Central Valley, again, washing that contamination or spreading it into local waterways. There's been a lot of questions, and I actually don't know the answer and would be interested if people know, but how are we accounting for extreme heat? I know obviously contaminants move differently, but are there differences in terms of how those materials move or dissipate in the environment, depending on heat or extended periods of extended extreme heat. And then, as we just heard, sea level rise, less of an issue in the Central Valley, but obviously a big issue in California and will impact a lot of sites. So just to give like a quick case study, this is one of the sites that I worked on very early in my career. It's in the city of Shafter in Kern County. This is a old pesticide manufacturing plant right in the middle of town, very close to communities. And in that case, we had a number of remedies, including soil removal, we had a cap, we did have deed restrictions, and we had soil vapor extraction units put on the site. So we had a lot of different remedies there. And a couple of these climate issues came up here. So, the first thing is when we did see the excavation of large amounts of soil, we had very big pits on site, and then we had, very heavy storms. And these pits all filled up with water. And so to a community resident, they're looking at the site and they're seeing ponds of water on a known contaminated site. So that obviously was very scary for residents. We didn't have a lot of answers in terms of what the impacts were, in terms of, is it moving contaminations down, is it moving contaminations up? Very scary for the community. A second thing that happened on that same site is we had extreme droughts. We had monitoring wells that were, put in many years before the remediation actually started. And in fact, by the time we had the remediation active, all of those groundwater monitoring wells had run dry, and we were not able to, determine whether or not the groundwater was safe or not. So that's just one example of one site that I happened to work on where the climate impacts were very real. And so just ending with a couple of recommendations. Obviously, I like the direction of the community considerate cleanups. I'm on that panel that was discussed before with other EJ advocates and with a lot of other stakeholders. I think it's been a really good place to brainstorm. But hopefully those guidelines, and I think they will, really prioritize early outreach to communities. They're part of the process of figuring out what remedy works for them. Continued engagement, so it's not just a kind of one and done, and then also really taking into account community perspectives in the ultimate remediation design, as well as ongoing accountability to make sure that the site remediation is happening as planned. Remedial action plans and other remediation activities, they should include measures to guard against extreme weather events. I haven't seen a lot of that in the plans themselves. And so how do we incorporate just the fact that we're gonna see extreme weather patterns, and how do we plan for that at the front end? So we're making sure that we're accounting for these weather events. And I do think that we should be more forthcoming with information, both about the air quality impacts and the greenhouse gas impacts associated, with our site remediation. I think there should be, more disclosure on what those impacts are, and they should be a part of the conversation and the decision making. I also, think that transportation routes should be disclosed as well. It's not just a matter of, we're going to do a dig and haul, and, after the trucks leave, we don't have to think about it anymore. I think communities really want to actually know, where are those trucks going? What communities are they going through? And then, yesterday I went to the bioremediation panel, and I will say that's where I'm seeing a lot of convergence in terms of, comfort level with communities. Is, they are very interested in looking at bioremediation, trees, fungi, plants, in order to remove some of that, the contamination in place. So I think there's a lot of interest in exploring that, and how do we find opportunities to prove this as a good methodology for site remediation in California. And so two things I'll just throw out there is, where are there public funds being used? Can we have that serve a dual purpose of trying to be a proving grounds? Right now in California, we have the orphan site program. Again, that's, tax dollars being spent for some of the site remediation. That could be a place where we start testing some of these new technologies in bioremediation, as well as our grant programs. I know they got cut, but there's still some funds there. And so it's another good opportunity to, maybe give a bump up to developers that are willing to try some of these technologies out that are more favored by communities. And so those are just a couple of things that I think DTSC can do to start moving the needle. And I think that's all I have. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you to all three of our panelists. Can we get another round of applause? Thank you. We have the microphone set up in the middle. We have roughly 10 to 15 minutes for questions. Does anyone want to step up and ask any questions to our panelists? Please don't all stand at once. Great.
Great presentation. Great presentation. Thank you very much. Ingrid, I have a question for you. You mentioned lack of trust with the public. You mentioned early engagement. I know that agencies are trying to have that early engagement, but do you have any recommendations to improve that trust? Because that is one of the bigger obstacles we see as we try to take into consideration climate and social impacts.
Try that.
Yeah, I mean, I think just in terms of like general principles is early engagement is going to be very important. Having flexibility in including those perspectives in actual decisions. Because I think a lot of what folks are thinking is, it's a checkbox. We have to go to community, we hear them, we do a hearing, we do that, and then we move on. And so folks aren't seeing the input that they're providing in the actual decisions at the end. And so I think early engagement will help with that flexibility in the front end so that those, that input can be actually integrated into into the decisions. And then in terms of, providing opportunities, for shared ownership, and that's more for maybe the land reuse at the end is, if folks really are bought in to whatever the vision is for that land reuse, I think you're going to open those conversation lines. You have a shared interest in having the site remediation done well, and then moving on to, making sure that there's a beneficial reuse at the end that the community believes in. So again, I think seeing less as community as an obstacle and more as a partner, I think that is going to go a long way. And then, as part of the member of the Board of Environmental Safety, one of our, in my mind, our North Star, or my North Star, let me say that, is I'm hoping the board can play an important role in increasing trust in DTSC so that we have that accountability. We have that more of a public setting. And so, that's a long-term thing. It's long overdue. But I'm hoping over time that we can start to rebuild community trust in the institution itself, which is obviously a big barrier.
Thank you, Ingrid. Ryan, what tools or strategies do you recommend to someone that's looking to undertake this approach, or even in just communicating this type of trade-off to someone else?
Sure. Yeah, great question there. I can think about a project example, one that I gave on our Dig and Haul site in downtown Los Angeles, and this is a project that's being met with has been met with community resistance, but for not necessarily with regards to our remediation program, but really the general future use of the site. But in this case, I gave that as an example of sort of a missed opportunity, and this is one where earlier engagement with our oversight agency on considering more climate-friendly alternatives is where we could have made a step in that direction initially. We also could have had those discussions with our client so that they understand the pros and the cons of different alternatives. In this case, it's a client that will intend to be holding onto this site for a very, very long time. And they may be okay with prioritizing schedule and getting this project in the ground and be comfortable with taking on some long-term monitoring and operations of the site kind of in perpetuity. So it really comes down to that early engagement, early discussions, and bringing a little creativity into the day-to-day of the work we do.
Thank you, Ryan. Any questions from the audience? Okay. Oh, please.
Hi. The question I have is about the apparent cognitive dissonance that occurs when we talk about the need for affordable housing, the need to redevelop brownfields, the need to use less invasive remedial techniques that are less impactful on the community, but at the same time making cleanups harder to achieve with more stringent regulations and lower cleanup goals and analysis paralysis and vapor intrusion. And we're at the point now where we're counting molecules to get the health risk down below 1 × 10⁻⁶, but we're leaving communities in situations where they don't have access to fresh fruits and vegetables, which has a much larger cancer impact. So we're at the point where we're unable to redevelop sites in California because of this restrictive regulatory regime, but we have all these other motivating factors that should really be pushing us to loosen up those regulations and get more projects done. And I'm wondering if the panelists have any comments about that.
Thank you. Any reactions to that question?
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. And we briefly touched on it, right? When Ryan brought up the idea, and I kind of echoed it on, achieving some sort of cleanup goal, obviously improving site conditions, but then leaving some whatever amount of waste left in place or impacts left in place in order to control that site and make sure that exposure is reduced as much as possible. I agree there is this dissonance between kind of primary drivers of health. But at the same time, it comes down to the point I think that Ryan ended his presentation on that I wanted to echo now, that it takes regulatory or government action to address this at a societal level. DTSC, the regional boards, Cal EPA as a whole, at their core are public health agencies, right? And so their regulations, their authority lies solely with public health, and DTSC specifically only with hazardous substances. So when all of us as regulators, we constantly tell ourselves we have to stay in our lane, right? DTSC doesn't have authority over X, Y, or Z. And DTSC doesn't have authority over things that we do see at sites, such as methane, right? Methane isn't categorized as a hazardous substance, and so DTSC actually can't take any action on it. So there is this red tape that needs to be addressed again at a statutory level in order to address this cognitive dissonance. And so the point that you make is well taken, right? You require a cleanup down to such a small level when where I live in LA, Los Angeles. You walk out the door and there's people sleeping on the streets, right? What's the health impact of somebody sleeping on a street next to a busy street, right? Versus the potential for vapor intrusion at a site that they're also sleeping next to. So there is this broader societal impact that needs to be addressed, but I don't think any individual agency is set up to address it.
Yeah, I've been giving that question some thought, and where I'm seeing some tension is, is that a lot of our land development, really relies on the private sector. And here we're talking about a public good, right? We're trying to get land that is not being used or maybe blighting a community, and we're trying to get that into to reuse. And from my end, like, I really like to see that land being reused in a way that benefits the community. And so, some things that I've been thinking about is, like, are there programs that happen in other states? The one that I've been looking at a lot is land banking. Is how do we get land that's been abandoned, not reused, and how can we get it into the hands more for the public good? And can we provide government programs in order to help cities do that, or to have state programs around that? I mean, I think the ECRG is another good example of, here we have, public funding and really prioritizing, community beneficial reuse at the end of that grant program. I know for me, I was working with a number of community groups who were very, very excited about this program. They wanted to do community parks and cultural centers, climate resiliency centers, things that really, were important to the communities, and yet none of them could apply because they didn't have access to land. They didn't have property ownership. So that was a huge barrier to this program that could have really allowed the communities to reuse use in the way that they saw benefit. So I think we need to look at more programs and understand where public funds, may be appropriate to provide public goods. So those are some of the things that I've been thinking about. And one other thing is, I know you said, that some of these new technologies, bioremediation, they just don't quite make sense in our current paradigm. And that's another issue is, how can we better integrate that into our site remediation programs, so that we can have site remediation that I think would be cheaper. I don't know. But that there are barriers in terms of timing and things like that, that there's these impediments, and how can we create the programs in DTSC in California so that we can start to move these alternatives to the normal cleanups that we see.
I had another thought, if we don't have another question. It'll be quick, Torrin, I promise. Back to the same point, though, of, cleaning up a site down to the, molecular level, very low screening level or whatnot, and then putting a new building on it, right? So many of our conversations at DTSC and at other regulatory agencies are about vapor intrusion, right? And you may have, post-construction confirmation sampling, right, to confirm that the vapors are not actually intruding into the indoor airspace of your brand new building, right? And what do we always happen? All the consultants know the answer to this. Interference, right? Interference from what? Brand new building materials that are at higher concentrations than typically what DTSC would be looking to regulate from a potential vapor intrusion. And again, I think that issue highlights the need for a broader regulatory framework where agencies from different, that have varying authorities need to kind of have their own individual role to play, because DTSC doesn't have authority over any building materials, right? DTSC only has authority of hazardous substances, specifically in environmental media, right? And so a building material intact used as function is not environmental media, and DTSC can't regulate it, and it's actually regulated, typically in a commercial scenario by OSHA, right, or Cal OSHA. And so again, I think that issue really highlights the dissonance and the disparity and division of authorities by various regulatory agencies that truly need to be coming together on a holistic approach to protect public health.
Thank you, Greg. Please.
So follow-up question for what you said, Greg, earlier. You mentioned DTSC has to stay in their lane and statutory change is necessary. So this is a topic that I think we've been talking about for a long time, green remediation. We talked about phyto. This is not a new topic. What do we need to do starting today to implement a statutory change? What would that look like? And how can we take action starting today to start really trying to provide some different opportunities to close out these sites to meet some of these other bigger climate and social challenges?
Oh, the million-dollar question. I would say, DTSC can't lobby itself, right? we are civil servants. We abide by the statutes that are give us our authority. And if we step outside of those bounds, we get in trouble very quickly, right? And so I would say you need to, all of the genesis of all of this authority, though, is coming from state lawmakers, right? They're the ones that are writing these regulations. And so I would encourage you to get in contact with wherever your local legislators are, say, letting them know this is an issue, letting them know that this is important to a lot of people, to highlight the impacts of it. If you can ever align it with the governor's, interests or, cheat sheet for his priorities or, future governor's priorities, I think that's an easier, we keep talking about path of least resistance. That's your path of least resistance, right, to affect change, is to align your interests and highlight the impacts and see, where there can be shared, kind of shared wins on affecting change. But beyond that, I'm not a policy advocate, unfortunately. So I know there are members of DTSC's team here from our policy group from Sacramento. I saw Eddie Moreno. I don't know if he's in the room today. He might be in the other room. But I would say I can connect you with him and see what we can do.
Thank you. Ooh, go ahead.
I would just add to that there's also this this community and public optics perspective that needs to be tackled in parallel, because if we are talking about leaving more contamination in the ground, not remediating to these infinitely low values, there's a public perception issue that comes with that this developer community is lobbying for easier pathways to do things cheaper and quicker and faster. And so I do think that this discussion of climate and a more broad definition of impacts to our local communities has a big seat as a driver in pushing this conversation forward. I think we have the drivers in place now. We have the needs for this type of development to give this conversation a little bit more teeth.
Thank you, Ryan and Greg. Can we get another round of applause for our great panelists today? Thank you.